Hey everyone, I'm Shaun Hagen, CEO of CartonCloud, and welcome back to This Week in Logistics. Each week, we break down what actually matters in logistics, not just the headlines and not just the hype. We talk about what happened, why it matters to you, and what you should do next. This week in logistics, the surface story is that nothing has completely broken, but I think that the more useful operator read is more to the opposite end of the spectrum. And under the surface, the system got a little bit more expensive, a little bit more administratively heavy, and a bit less tolerant of loose execution. And that combination matters because that is usually how margin leaks start, not with one dramatic event, but with lots of smaller frictions that all land in the same week. Over the last few episodes, we have tracked a very deliberate progression. We went from policy friction to margin compression to surcharge season to what I call the invoice has arrived. But if you zoom out across this week's stories from across the world, they all point to something far more serious. What is genuinely new this week is that fuel has stopped being just a cost problem and has officially become a supply problem. As many of us have already heard, peace talks between the US and Iran collapsed over the weekend. On Sunday, President Trump announced a US Navy blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. Brent crude immediately jumped 8% to $103 a barrel, and across the Tasman, Australia's diesel is approaching $3 a litre at some stations, despite the government actively tapping into strategic reserves. If I had to name this week's theme, it is this: from invoices to blockades. The cost story has mutated into a continuity story. At the exact same time, we're seeing structural industry realignment, like FedEx spinning off its massive freight division mid-crisis. So first, let's hit the news desk and get you caught up. We've had another massive, fast-moving news cycle this week, so let's run through the top stories moving the needle. After 21-hour ceasefire talks in Islamabad failed, President Trump announced a US Navy blockade of Iranian ports in the Strait of Hormuz on April the 13th. CENTCOM clarified that blockade targets Iranian ports specifically and not general transit, but the geopolitical shock sent Brent crude surging 8%. We're going to unpack exactly what this means for your physical supply chain in deep dive number 1. Emergency fuel surcharges have officially expanded from ocean freight into inland haulage and intermodal transport. ONE introduced dedicated inline haulage for the US and Canada effective April 18, and MSC announced further increases effective May 1. We'll deep dive into this multi-layered cost nightmare in deep dive number 2. Still on the cost front, Amazon announced a 3.5% fuel and logistics surcharge on its FBA fulfillment fees for third-party sellers in Canada and the US, effective April 17. That means at the end of this week, that's coming into effect. E-commerce fulfillment just got a little bit more expensive. In Australia, the federal government has halved its fuel excise and released 20% of its strategic reserves, and yet diesel is still soaring, and 3 to 4% of stations have reported outages. In New Zealand, onshore diesel sits at just 22 days of cover, barely above the 21-day minimum obligation. We're going to cover this alongside the Strait of Hormuz blockade in our first deep dive. C.H. Robinson's April freight market update projects truckload costs up 16 to 17% year over year, driven primarily by capacity constraints and diesel prices that surged from $3.72 to $5.40 a gallon in March. The spot to contract gap has compressed to just 11 cents per mile. FedEx Freight held its inaugural investor day ahead of the June 1 spinoff. The largest LTL carrier in North America is going independent, promising to slash 300 applications from its IT stack and heavily automate its billing. We'll talk about why this structural industry shift matters to your mid-market operation in deep dive number 3. Finally, analysts are warning that a clean trilateral extension of the USMCA by July the 1st is now highly unlikely. Talks are splintering into bilateral negotiations, meaning cross-border compliance and documentation requirements are only going to increase. Now, before we get into the heavy analysis, it's time for our logistics fun fact of the week. Since the FedEx Freight spinoff is dominating the news this week, I want to remind us about a legendary piece of FedEx logistics history. Back in 1973, a young Federal Express was struggling to survive. The company was down to its last $5,000, which wasn't even enough to buy jet fuel to fly the planes for another week, let alone meet payroll. Facing bankruptcy, founder Fred Smith literally took the company's last $5,000, went to Las Vegas, and played blackjack. He turned that $5,000 into $27,000, just enough to buy fuel, keep the planes in the air for one more week, and crucially secure their next round of funding. A literal gamble that had a massive lasting impact on modern logistics. All right, from Vegas blackjack back down to your daily operations, let's get into our first deep dive. I want to start with the biggest and most alarming shift this week. As we've been talking about for the last several weeks, charges and margin compression have been ever present. That was a pricing conversation. What's changed over the weekend with the US Navy blockading the Strait of Hormuz is that conversation has shifted entirely to the physical supply. Look at what's happening in Australia right now. The federal government didn't halve the fuel excise and release 20% of its strategic reserves just because prices were uncomfortably high. They did it because the physical supply chain is under genuine stress. Over 550 service stations around Australia have reported being out of at least one fuel type. Diesel shortages hit regional Australia incredibly hard right in the middle of the autumn sowing season. Farmers are literally facing a decision about whether they can plant their cereal crops because they cannot reliably source diesel to run the tractors. In New Zealand, the picture is even more structurally exposed. New Zealand imports roughly 90% of its refined fuel, primarily from Asian refineries in South Korea and Singapore, and those refineries depend on crude oil transiting through the Strait of Hormuz. South Korea has already capped its refined fuel exports at 2025 levels. If Seoul tightens that further, New Zealand's supply chain gets squeezed even more before anyone else. The New Zealand government's response is highly instructive. They published a 4-phase fuel response plan. Phase 1 is where they are now. The market's operating, but prices are rising. Phase 2 involves the government directing how fuel is distributed. And Phase 3 starts to set strict rules about when and how commercial customers purchase fuel. And Phase 4 prioritizes life-preserving services only. The fact that a government is openly publishing a 4-phase rationing framework tells you everything you need to know right now. This is not a temporary price spike. This is a structural vulnerability being actively tested by a geopolitical crisis. For operators, the practical question is no longer just, how do I pass through the surcharge? The question is, what happens to my network if diesel becomes intermittently unavailable in certain regions? This is a continuity question, not a pricing question, and it requires a completely different type of planning. Our second major theme this week builds directly on that. In last week's episode, I warned about the surcharge season and how margin compression gets dangerous when it arrives on different clocks across different modes. This week, that dynamic has intensified materially. The surcharges have jumped the fence. Here's what happened. Between roughly the 9th of March and the 25th of March, the 5 largest container carriers, MSC, Maersk, CMA, CGM, and Hapag-Lloyd, all announced emergency fuel surcharges on ocean freight. That was the first wave. Since then, those surcharges expanded into a second wave: inland haulage, intermodal transport, and fulfilment. O&E replaced its earlier inland surcharge with a massive dedicated inland haulage fee structure for the US and Canada, effective April 18. Hapag-Lloyd announced inland emergency fuel surcharges for North Europe. MSC announced further increases on Asia to North America ocean trades effective May 1. And then Amazon laid on a 3.5% fuel and logistics surcharge on its FBA fulfillment fees effective April 17, covering US, Canada, Mexico, and Brazil. From an operator perspective, this is the most dangerous kind of cost environment. Your ocean costs, your inland drayage costs, your intermodal costs, your e-commerce fulfillment costs are all being repriced on different schedules by different parties using different calculation methods. As we've been saying, if you are reviewing your surcharge exposure on a monthly cadence, you are almost certainly underestimating your total landed cost right now and very likely bleeding cash. The operators I see handling this well are the ones who have moved to weekly fuel surcharge reviews tied directly to published benchmark data. I spoke to an operator in Melbourne recently who updated their fuel surcharge 3 times in 2 weeks because the pace of movement made monthly reviews completely inadequate. That's the kind of operational discipline that sets operators apart who maintain margin from operators who discovered 3 months later that a massive customer was secretly unprofitable. Finally, let's look at the FedEx freight story because this is structural. When FedEx spins off its $8.7 billion freight division into an independent public company mid-crisis, when it cuts 300 applications from its IT stack, when it automates its billing to reduce manual touches by 60%, and reduces shipment initiation from 5 clicks to 1 click, that is not a routine business decision. That is a massive enterprise that has concluded the LTL market requires a fundamentally different, faster operating model. And the timing matters. This is happening while diesel is in near record highs, while small carriers in the US are parking their trucks and exiting the market entirely, and while tender rejection rates are climbing because carriers are declining loads that they simply cannot make profitable. FedEx's incoming CEO explicitly said that their current customer experience is a disadvantage because it's tied to a broader legacy system. They're betting that simplicity and tech speed will win them business from small and mid-sized customers. For mid-market operators, the lesson is exactly what we talk about on this show every week. Technology amplifies good operations. It does not fix broken ones. If the largest LTL carrier in North America has concluded that cutting 300 applications and simplifying its technology stack is the only path to growth, you should be asking the exact same question about your own systems. How fast can you onboard a new customer? How fast can you adjust your pricing? How fast can you collect to a new tool or platform? If your answer is measured in months, the market is going to move before your project ever goes live. Industry restructuring accelerates during a crisis, and the operators who survive are the ones with integration, speed, and flexibility. So where does all this leave the operator playbook for the next 7 days? Well, part 1, tighten commercial controls. As we've been talking about, review quote validity periods, recheck surcharge assumptions, make sure customers understand what is temporary, what is variable, and what is now effectively embedded in the market. If your commercial team is still treating surcharge updates as edge cases, that needs to change. Part 2, audit border and compliance workflows. If you have any North American exposure, especially US-Mexico, now is the time to look at documentation quality, broker coordination, tariff logic, and refund readiness. This is not just a custom story, it's a process maturity test. And the same applies more broadly across cross-border freight globally. If your admin process is messy, your cost recovery and service reliability will be messy too. In part 3, invest in reliability before the customer asks for it. That does not always mean buying something. It can mean cleaning up exception workflows, improving ETA logic, tightening rerouting decisions, or just giving your ops team better playbooks. The bigger point is that reliability is no longer just a service value, it's a commercial value, and customers will pay attention to who creates the fewest surprises over the next quarter. For your watch list next week, keep an eye on whether the US blockade triggers any Iranian retaliation in the Strait. Watch for the April 18 effective date on ONE's new inland haulage fees, and monitor Australia and New Zealand onshore diesel stock levels. If onshore diesel drops below 20 days near the country, the conversation shifts from pricing to rationing very, very quickly. I'm Shaun Hagen. This has been This Week in Logistics. Spot the pattern early, simplify your response, and this week's plan for continuity and not just cost. I'll see you all next week.